Hello everyone, it is May 6th and time for another garden tour. It is prime planting time right now, so it has been a very busy week, but I think I've finally gotten ahead on everything that needs planted out into the garden, and now I'm just dealing with some pests and general maintenance, and I probably need to remulch a lot of my garden beds, but other than that, I'm excited to show you how far some of my plants have come in the last month since my April garden tour, and also the many new plants that are in my garden. And I'll also be showing you some of the pest challenges I am currently facing right now, and some of the things I am trying in order to keep that in check. A recent addition that is growing prolifically already are my pea plants. Peas are so exciting. I love to snack on them right out of the garden. I have 3 different types this year. I have snow peas, snap peas, and the classic shelling pea. We'll see if any of them make it to the point of being cooked, because fresh peas are so great raw, just right off the plant. I also planted out my tomato plants right here, and they're still going through their adjustment period to the soil, but they will probably start growing much faster very soon. Last month, these were just sprouting, but here are my cosmos. I planted on the edges of the garden. Not only are they beautiful, these cosmos flowers, but they provide a great pest trap to keep pests out of my plants that I want to harvest from. So I planted a bunch of cosmos, mainly in my main garden bed along the border, but also throughout some other areas of my yard. Here I have a melon plant looking not the greatest, but still alive. So the reason I can't just throw a lot of my seeds in the garden and forget about them, such as my beans, squash, melons, sunflowers, is because I have a serious infestation of what are nicknamed cutworms. They're actually caterpillars. So basically, these type of cutworms, they live in the garden soil and they crawl out at night, wrap their little bodies around the stems of young plants, and just nibble the stem right off. So when you come out in the morning, it literally looks like somebody took a scissors to a bunch of your plants, cut them in half, basically. So what I've had to do, and what the only method that has had at least mild success so far, is taking the meticulous time to wrap each of the little stems. For the case of my watermelons and my squash plants, I did start them a little early in pots so that they could get a little bit of a thicker stem before I planted them in the garden. But basically, last year, the cutworms killed all of my bush bean plants, nearly all of my pole beans, the majority of my squash and melon plants, and I tried all sorts of natural remedies, but I found the most effective thing so far has just been wrapping their stems. It is definitely not foolproof. I'd say I have an 80% success rate with wrapping their stems, because they have been getting very tricky. Sometimes they'll crawl up the wrap portion and then pick at each smaller stem with a leaf on it, like you can see on this plant right here, or they'll just crawl up the stem and still nibble at the main stem, depending on how hungry they are, I guess. But I am looking into other things, like possibly introducing some beneficial nematodes to my garden bed. Obviously, those do cost money, so I really have to weigh the investment versus using my free but time-consuming version of wrapping them in packing paper. But yeah, that is probably my biggest pest problem that I've been dealing with this year, and it was definitely my biggest last year too, is just trying to deal with these cutworms without using any chemicals or having to heavily till up my soil, since I don't have a tiller and I practice no-till gardening. I planted out some of my pepper plants, the larger ones. Once again, cutworms like young pepper plants. This one's looking pretty nice. I have a few other nice looking ones that I've planted out already. Here are my spaghetti squash. These are probably the fastest growing squash that I have planted. I've only lost one of them to the cutworm so far. They're looking pretty nice. Here I have my corn and some of my pole beans. They are quite nibbled up by insects, but I find that beans, assuming they don't have their stem cut off, grow fast enough that they can deal with some heavy nibbling on their leaves. So I think these will do just fine once they get a little bigger. I don't think the leaf nibbling will be much of a problem. I might spray them with some peppermint oil just to give them a little bit of a pest resistant boost in their young age. So I practiced this Three Sisters method. So I've got my corn growing next to my pole beans, which will kind of pole bean up the corn. The only problem is the pole beans tend to grow much faster than the corn, so they end up kind of going everywhere. But it's an old tried and true method. You plant your corn, beans, and squash together, so my squash plants are right next to the corn and beans also. This is one of my honeydew plants. Unfortunately, I started these in pots, and they just didn't grow very well. They were quite small when I put them out already, so they were already susceptible to pests, and so the cutworms have killed all but one of these plants. I have planted more honeydew seeds because I did get a harvest of honeydew last year, and fresh garden honeydews taste so good. I know some people really hate the taste of honeydew, but I really like honeydew. And so I am determined to grow some in my garden again this year. So I have replanted some seeds in the soil. Unfortunately, as you can see, something has been digging around in this mound right after I have planted the seeds, so I may have to plant more. I do have a lot of critters going around my garden, but generally bugs are the biggest problem. I have a few groundhogs that I sometimes see breathing underneath the soil. It looks like the soil's moving a lot of the time, and I think it scared me at first, but now I just think it's kind of fun. If I ever see that while filming, I'll be sure to show you guys. Generally, I like the groundhogs because these animals keep the soil nice and loose for me, and I haven't found them as too much of an issue to have around, and I really like just observing them. My cats really like observing them too. Here I have a Long Island cheese squash, something new I'm trying this year. I guess the spaghetti squash I'm also growing for the first time this year, but I've never even tasted this type of squash before. I got it because it's supposed to taste good and it's supposed to be easy to store for a good portion of the winter without worrying about them rotting. I have a sugar pumpkin plant. It's looking pretty nice right here. Here are my butternut squash plants, not looking too bad. The reason these look kind of glossy is because unfortunately, when these plants were very young, they started developing mildew, and it seems like within a day, first these butternut plants were covered in white, and then the next day, the rest of my squash plants I had started, except for the spaghetti squash, were also covered in white, and so I made a homemade fungicide that I sprayed them with, and it has been working pretty well. The only downside is I have to spray them weekly, otherwise the fungus starts coming back, but it's basically just a mixture of baking soda and natural soap and maybe something else. I'll have to make a video maybe in the future about the recipe for the homemade fungicide, but it has been working nicely. I mean, obviously, it would have been great if my plants hadn't gotten mildew in the first place, but it is better than having to throw away all the plants I started and try to start again. I also, in addition to butternut squash, I'm trying honey nut squash this year. I've never actually tried honey nut squash, but it's supposed to be pretty good. But those plants are looking nice. Here is, I don't even know what this is. It just started growing in my yard. It may have been a stray gourd seed. It's growing pretty nicely. I'm just gonna see if it turns into anything. Here's my patty pan squash. They are having a time with the cutworms too. I planted a few more additional seeds in the ground. But the one right there is looking fine. I've also, to my memory, never had patty pan squash. It's supposed to taste like zucchini, but maybe slightly better. I'm not a big zucchini fan, but I thought I'd try these out. They're supposed to be really prolific, you know, if they don't get killed when they're young. I also have some delicata squash, which multiple YouTubers suggested growing. It's supposed to be a really delicious squash. Once again, I've never tried it, but I'm excited to potentially try it this year. And cucumbers. I have multiple cucumbers growing. This is my first time trying to grow cucumbers on this property. My dad did grow cucumbers when I was a kid, but they were pickling cucumbers, and I never really liked pickling cucumbers. They were always kind of bitter to me, at least the ones we grew, and I remember the plants would always get mildew and often weren't very prolific, but these actually haven't had, unlike the other plants, haven't really had issues with mildew. And these are not pickling cucumbers, and I do like to snack on cucumbers every once in a while. They just make me feel really refreshed. Unfortunately, the store-bought cucumbers, the ones that actually taste good, are usually expensive, and they don't last very long in the refrigerator, and I often would forget to eat them in a timely manner. So hopefully these will grow. This is a nice watermelon plant here that hasn't been killed, and a smaller one next to it. I love fresh garden watermelon. It is just a summer delight. So I tried to plant a lot of watermelon. I think last year only one of my plants survived, and I got one very tiny watermelon out of it, and I did save the seeds. The hill that I planted with the few seeds that I saved, those plants actually seem more resistant to the cutworms. They haven't had any damage yet compared to the ones that I planted with just the seeds I had left from the year before. So I am really into the potential of saving a lot of the seeds from my garden. I've started small, but I really think it can be beneficial over time as over generations, the seeds really start to adapt to your specific soil and the specific pests that your area has. And I think it can be really beneficial and time-saving in the future to save your own seeds and have less pest issues and more prolific plants. Not to mention it saves money. Here are some of my blueberry plants. This first one, a blue-ray blueberry I just planted this year. I do have another blue-ray blueberry that I planted last year, and also behind it is a blue crop blueberry that I planted last year that's getting quite large. Okay, I have a bit of a minefield here. If you haven't noticed, I am staring at a bunch of poison ivy right here, and I'm currently in sandals. I'm trying to get to my Canada's grape plant, which, yay, it didn't die for real after the outlier deep freeze there was in April. The leaves had died back and it looked dead for the longest time, but you can kind of see, though the sun is kind of washing it out, there are some leaves growing. Now I just need to cut down all the poison ivy so I can properly get to this plant in the future. Normally, I wouldn't have anything against poison ivy. They are native plants, they're beneficial to many animals. But unfortunately, I am not part of the small percentage of people that do not react to the slightest touch of poison ivy. Luckily, I'm not severely allergic to it. It's just more of a nuisance. Here I have my winter choy that I planted this year. Unfortunately, as you can see, it's already starting to bolt, starting to go to seed, but that's kind of to be expected. This is a new plant I'm trying out, and they're actually meant more for fall planting. They're supposed to be super cold hardy, so I'm going to plant a bunch of them in the fall. But I just experimented with planting a few plants this spring because I wanted to see kind of what they look like, what they tasted like. But yeah, it has been quite nice weather, so that one looks pretty nice, but it's unfortunately going to seed and won't get much bigger. This one looks not so nice and is still going to seed. And look over here, it looks like I have a wild grape plant growing among my garden bed. I do really like the taste of wild grapes. Here's one of my spring kale plants. It's looking all right. Very slow growing, and I've debated whether to keep trying to grow kale, but once it is established, it does keep producing for a really long time. Here I have an insane amount of green onions. These were old seeds, so I just kind of threw them everywhere, and they apparently all germinated. I'll have a nice harvest of green onions forever, since they spread on their own, and a nice pest deterrent for this bed. Here's some bok choy looking very nice. Some of my bok choy look nice like this, and some of it looks more like this. I do spray peppermint oil and sometimes soapy water on my brassicas and greens because pests tend to really like to eat them. So here's a broccoli plant. It's not looking too bad. Some of my broccoli plants look nice, and some of them look not so nice. You know, I guess it's all about balance. Gotta sacrifice a few plants to nature, despite my best efforts. This bok choy, I mean, it's growing. It's a little chewed up. Here's one of my spring spinach plants. Another spinach plant. Last year, I didn't have as many issues with pests eating my spinach. This year, it's been a little bit worse, I'd say. As you can see, I planted the bok choy rather close to the broccoli. That is because the bok choy will almost certainly bolt and be done before the broccoli gets too big. I have some nice looking chard over here. Luckily, not much bothers chard, but some of my chard also looks super tiny still. There's another winter choy plant. The advantage of chard is that even though it's slow growing, it does, like kale, kind of just keep growing for a long time. Not as winter hardy as kale, though. Over here I have some very large bok choy. Once again, I planted all these greens at the same time. Like I planted all the bok choy seeds at the same time, all the broccoli, etc. But yeah, there's a big disparity in the size of them. But these bok choy, some of these are huge. They're getting a little eaten up, but they're growing to compensate for it. And you can see there's broccoli among these too. Here is my fig tree. Unfortunately, my fig tree suffered the same fate as my grape plant during the outlier deep freeze. All the foliage kind of died off, but it started growing back pretty quickly, and so it's slowly but surely leafing out again. Here I have one of my heritage raspberry plants, and as you can see, it's blossoming and growing little raspberries. I love raspberries, guys. And oh, my strawberries. All my strawberries are just leafing out like crazy. Some are bigger than others, but they are flowering and producing tiny berries. Over here, this is the one that will be ripe first very soon. It's already starting to turn a little bit pink, and assuming I can protect it from the critters, I'll have to cover it once it gets a little darker in color, because it's like the critters can smell it the moment, and probably see it too, the moment it gets a little pink. I'm going to have so many strawberries this year. I planted this bed last year, got a few berries. This year, I'm going to have so many berries. I love fresh picked strawberries. These are the ones that are producing the earliest, are early glow strawberries, but I also have two other varieties, Jewel and Sparkle, that will produce next. Some are already producing strawberries. Each individual plant is really following its own timeline. The plants don't really care which variety they are. I have some Sparkle plants that are further ahead than some of the early glow plants. I have newly planted chamomile. I know chamomile can be really beneficial for many things, so I bought it. It hasn't really grown much since I planted it. It's taken its time to get used to the soil. I mean, it was probably in some very nice Miracle Grow soil, and it's probably having an aneurysm right now because of the soil that I put it in, which isn't bad, but it's not fertilized soil. It's compost and dirt from my yard. But here's my oregano plant. It's quite ready to harvest. I'll be doing a harvesting video pretty soon. And here's my sage. It's about to start flowering. I have some bush beans here that, honestly, most of them have already gotten killed by cutworms. But I think a few of the bush beans will survive this year. I've got their little stems wrapped. These are in my strawberry bed. I've also got some peas growing in my strawberry bed. Here's my tiny thyme plants. Oh, fun fact. So I had started some thyme plants from seed this year, as I had tried and failed last year. And two of them actually survived to be not quite as big as this, but they were getting close to this size. And so I planted them out next to my apple trees, and little did I know that in the forest there is some critter that just loves thyme plant, or hates it, I don't know. But literally the next day after I planted them, the one plant was completely gone and the other plant had no leaves on it anymore. So I was a little bit sad about that, because thyme takes a lot of time to grow, and I had nursed those plants for months. But that's the story of the garden sometimes, and sometimes you just gotta take in the journey, your plant journey, and take note of things. And next time, if I plant more thyme, I'll know that I should cover the young plants until they are well established. My fall spinach, most of it has gone to seed now, so I've kind of picked those over. I am collecting the seeds from a few of the nicer ones, but those lasted a good long time. I think I planted those in August of last year. And so I've gotten certainly a great harvest out of a lot of my fall spinach plants. These flowers are actually from my fall bok choy. It went to flower, and I've been kind of eating the flowers because they are quite tasty, but also I'm letting them bloom because they act as a great pest trap around my other plants that haven't gone to seed yet, like this kale from the fall. Here's my year-old celery plant that kind of died back during the winter, but somehow still survived, and it's leafing out. Here's my probably nicest looking broccoli plant. Once again, I planted this at the same time as all my other broccoli plants, but look how huge it is compared to that also nice looking one over there. I don't know what makes this certain area so special, but this is my biggest broccoli plant. But I've also got some other nice size ones along here growing. Here are my popcorn plants, and little did I know when I filmed this that the next day I would wake up to find that the cutworms had destroyed the majority of these plants. Those nematodes are looking better every day. Here are my onions. They've grown slowly but surely. I have these in a raised bed that I built this year. I'll also be putting my sweet potatoes in this bed eventually, which I've been sprouting from a store-bought potato. It is starting to sprout. I'm excited that I actually successfully did that. This will be my first time ever planting sweet potatoes. They're supposed to be really prolific. I've got some carrots. I planted in a really weird way this year. I've been experimenting with different ways. I don't think I'll try this method again. It was kind of only semi-successful. I've also got some radishes. I had some old radish seeds I just kind of threw in with the carrots. Here is my immortal cabbage, or aka my cabbage that somehow survived the winter. It is going to seed right now. You can see it's going crazy. I am definitely harvesting some of these seeds. And unfortunately, this cabbage never produced a head. It was my first time trying to grow cabbage, and this was the only plant that survived and survived the whole winter. I did watch a video by Gardenary about how to increase your chances of a cabbage producing a head. One thing is to prune the lower leaves, aside from having making sure your soil is really good. So I will probably be doing that on my cabbages this year to see if I can get them to form a head. Unfortunately, if you saw my April video, you know that my cabbage plants were suffering a little bit because I had planted them too early and they got leggy. But here you can see they are doing a little better. They're still potted up. I have planted a few out. I'm slowly planting the largest ones out, and hopefully they'll produce some nice cabbages. I have my singular rosemary plant here. I did not start this plant from seed, but last year I failed at successfully growing rosemary from seed. I know it is notoriously difficult and slow growing. This year I thought I had almost succeeded. The plants made it many months, but then they got some fungal disease that I didn't notice in time, and all my rosemary plants died. Also, all my cumin plants died. That was a new thing that I was trying this year. Maybe next year. I know it's supposed to be easier to propagate rosemary from cuttings than to start them from seeds, so I might try to experiment with that. This is my Primus white currant, which I don't know. I don't even know if it's been a month since I planted this. It's been around that, but this plant has just exploded. No soil amendments whatsoever. Here is my Honeycrisp apple tree that I planted this year. For some reason, it already flowered. I wasn't really worried about the flowers getting pollinated because I don't have any other tree that flowered at the same time that I know of. So I don't think the flowers got pollinated, which is probably a good thing since it's basically just a stick right now. As far as things I haven't planted out yet, I've got my basil. It's looking much better. And I've got a lemongrass right here. And my celery that's grown slightly larger. It's growing slowly but surely. I've also got some tiny ground cherries, a new thing I'm trying out this year, and some pepper plants that I haven't planted out because they're too small and would just be decimated by the cutworms right now. A new addition is a peppermint. I've been heavily debating whether to put a peppermint in my garden, as I learned very young from my grandma, is you should never plant peppermint directly into the ground unless you really want to have an entire yard full of peppermint. Granted, it would probably help with pest problems, but I know that's not most people's ideal. So you must always plant peppermint in a pot. So I did get some because I use peppermint quite often. Last new additions, I have a lemon balm. Lemon balm, not only have I found that the leaves taste really great just to snack on, but it's supposed to help deter pests and it helps with anxiety. And here is citronella. This also helps deter pests. And that is just about everything in my garden. Thank you to everyone that stuck around this whole long video to hear me go on about everything in my garden. I'm so excited to get to harvest all these crops, and even though it is often a challenge dealing with pests, it's just so rewarding working in the garden and knowing all the delicious food I'm going to be able to harvest. And I hope you're finding the same peace working in your own garden, whether it's a new garden or a well-established garden. And I hope you find as much joy as I do, or maybe even more joy than I do, in each thing that you are able to successfully grow, and that you are constantly learning and experimenting with new ways to make your garden even better. Happy gardening all. Goodbye.